So, in this podcast, we're just going to review a little bit of the reading that you would have done in Tomasino's work and looking at some of the kind of indicators of Hellenization. So, a few things to note. First of all, one of the um, major signs of the effect of Greek influence within the area is the increase of the Greek language being used by people. So, a couple of things about the use of the Greek language. There are signs that Greek was used in Palestine even prior to Alexander the Great's invasion. So, there was already some contact between people living in Palestine and Greek speakers coming in and exchanging things, and artifacts have been found. So even before that time, we see the introduction of Greek. But by the second century BC, a Koine Greek. Now, this word Koine here means basically common, the type of Greek that would have been spoken by uh, most Greeks, not uh, the Greek that is much more formal that you would find in other kinds of works, but the type of common Greek was the primary language of diaspora Jews. So this term diaspora refers to Jews who are living outside of the land of Palestine. So there are lots of Jews, in lots of different places. Some had been taken off into Babylon by the Babylonians, and many of them stayed there. You have Greeks who are living in Egypt, had become conquered by the Greeks. Of course, you have Jews living in places like Syria and Antioch, and you'll have them living in Asia Minor and all over. So, any Jews who are living outside of Palestine, one of the languages that is used kind of to connect them all is Koine Greek. So, but what was the Greek usage like in Palestine? Now, that's a very interesting question. And so, one of the things although we can see evidence that Greek has been brought into the region, and though it is likely that, rulers are speaking in Greek. So, in other words, when you get to the first century, you have somebody like Herod the Great, or you have um, Herod Antipas. You have these individuals. They're probably speaking Greek. And when you think even likely the high priest could very well likely speak Greek, since this is kind of becomes the language that is around the whole kind of Mediterranean world. And there are going to be lots of Greek speaking Jews who will come to Jerusalem for the various festivals. But what we don't really know is how much uh, language the common agrarian Jew would have had. So this raises, of course, the question about Jesus and whether or not Jesus knew Greek. Now, the New Testament or the Gospels indicate that Jesus had conversations with non-Jews. And so you got to wonder, well, what would that language would that conversation have been in? Is it likely that people who are foreigners or non-Jews picked up the Aramaic language that would have been common? Or is it more likely that Jews living in Palestine, knowing that there are these foreigners coming in, and if they're wanting to have an economic prosperity, may have picked up enough Greek in order to converse with foreigners. Now, there were certainly one of the ways in which um, people like Herod the Great and Herod Antipas tried to win Gentiles, non-Jews, into the area was to build cities that would attract them to come and live. So you have places like Sepphoris, which was near where Jesus lived in Nazareth, and you have places like Tiberias. And so these cities that were created very likely had people there who were speaking Greek. So, um, this is still an area of some debate among scholars, the extensiveness of the Greek language in Palestine and how pervasive it may have been. But I think it's probably safe to say that Greek is certainly used in Palestine, and that it seems quite likely that those who are more prosperous, those who are more kind of connected to people of power and influence, um, and who are kind of driving the economy, they're likely to have some kind of knowledge of Greek, and Jesus is likely to have picked up some Greek, but how extensive his knowledge of Greek is, it's hard to know for certain. Another way in which we see kind of an indicator of Hellenization is the constructions of the agora as city centers. So, in kind of Jewish village life, you don't really have these marketplaces, but those are common features of Greek cities. And so, when these Greek cities are being built in the first centuries, to have a kind of a marketplace is a key feature of kind of city life and city kind of commerce and interactivity. Now, it may be interesting that since Jerusalem was never really, originally built as a Greek city, what you do end up having is a kind of a courtyard, at least during the time of Herod the Great, outside of the temple, which may have acted something like like an agora, especially for the purposes of buying animals in order to be able to use in temple services or getting money exchanged. So when Jesus, goes into the courtyard of the temple, court of Gentiles, basically, this could have been a place where not only Gentiles would have come and would have interacted in business, um, as well as Jews who would come there to buy what they would need to go into the temple area. And so um, it's interesting where the agora for a place like Jerusalem might have been located. So that's another feature. And then another interesting thing that arises kind of the ideal of marriage as monogamy. So, um, it seems that for most Jews, there probably was only one man and one woman in kind of marriage. But it was not uncommon to know of people who had more than one wives. So, of course, somebody, um, like um, a Jacob could have two wives. So, if the father, kind of one of the fathers of the nation, can have more than one wife, there's a precedent that's set there. And of course, we know that kings certainly had more than one wives. Solomon had many wives, but a lot of those were for political alliances. So while there certainly were exceptions, it does not seem to be that marriage was, um, uh, that polygamy was something that could not have been practiced by Jews. But Greeks saw that really, for legitimacy of children, you only had one man and one wife, one legal wife. And so they brought in as well a stronger ideal of monogamy, so that Jews as well kind of adopted this ideal, so that, you know, you typically do not find the common Jew, the average Jew, having multiple wives. So that's another indication of Hellenization. And maybe interesting that we find in the pastoral epistles, in First Timothy and in Titus, this ideal that an elder is someone who is going to have be somebody who's has one woman. Now, of course, the passage is a little bit controversial whether or not it's referring to a rejection of polygamy, since polygamy was not very common for most Jews, definitely not for most Greeks or Romans. While it was, so why would Paul need to have this kind of requirement for elders? Maybe that's the ideal is that the person is faithful to their spouse and not a kind of a womanizer, not somebody out having lots of sexual relationships with women. And that's who the person who should be the overseer. So anyway, the ideal of marriage as monogamy is an indicator of Hellenization. So a couple of other things just to highlight here from your reading in Tomasino, democratic structures and interactions in synagogues and in the Sanhedrin. So this kind of idea of sharing of roles, more greater participation. So you don't just have, kind of one person who has this kind of absolute authority, and you don't have this kind of dialogue where different people are sharing ideas and conversing and arriving at decisions. So we see participation in synagogues and for the Sanhedrin, which is like this council, and they make decisions. And so, but this decision is made by different people having kind of a vote on how that would carry out. We also see a religious syncretism, so this kind of mixture of ideas and thoughts in expressing Jewish faith. Kind of very interesting as well, astrology. So the bringing in, as it were, the concept of looking at the stars and trying to interpret what's going on in the heavens, or having representation of the stars, the zodiac, as it were, on items. But there's also word limits. You had to be careful not to buy in too much. You could use some aspects that might be representative of the different, cultures, but there were certain things that many Jews felt like they had to maintain in order to keep themselves distinctive from other faiths or non-Jewish faith. And we also see a lot more philosophical inquiry, and this is particularly influenced by Platonism and Stoicism, two of the really more popular views, Greek concepts at the time. So within Platonic idea, a key concept is this distinction between the physical world and the unseen world. So for Plato, the physical world was not, the ultimate reality. That these were more like shadows, or these were representations of other realities. And so to humans, kind of set their minds, set their sights on those realities, and understand how these worlds are a reflection of that reality. And Stoicism. With Stoicism, you're looking at this concept of a world that is ordered, and to align oneself with the world and the way in which it has been ordered, particularly with reason. And so a person pursues the good life or the ideal life as they align their decisions based upon what the logos, which is this kind of concept of a force, a reason that kind of brings about the world and orders the world. So, in particular, a lot of this is Platonism, Stoicism can use allegory. And so, with allegory, one thing stands for another. So, for Plato, the things that are in the physical world stand for some other reality. And there seems also to be an avoidance of anthropomorphic language or imagery for God. So oftentimes, in the biblical Old Testament, we'll talk about, God's hand or God's arm. So that would be anthropomorphic language to represent God like a human. So, shying away from that, avoiding using that kind of language to describe God is part of the influence of Greek thought into the region. So anyway, these are several of these kind of indicators of Hellenization. So when we read particularly New Testament materials, we're kind of looking as well for ways in which the early Christian communities might also reflect some of these values, democratic structures, democratic interactions. We might see how they mix, as it were, some of their beliefs or faith about Jesus, as well with some of the ideas, concepts that would have been circulating in the greater Mediterranean world. And we also try to see comparisons to some of the expressions within Christianity and how they compare and contrast with some of these leading philosophical influences at the time, like Platonism and Stoicism. So that gives you a taste of the indication of Hellenization as discussed by Tomasino.